Has it really been 6 months already? The Overwatch League is over and so are the playoffs. All that's left is the oncoming Grand Final, which will be an intense rematch of the Stage 2 semifinal. In today's video, I'm going to break down what I think is going to happen in the Grand Final. Of course, hovering overhead is the huge asterisk that no analyst was even close to right with how the playoffs turned out. Who would have thunk it? A brand new patch really is going to throw a wrench into things. But also in today's video, we're going to take a look back at what happened in the playoffs, as well as sort of a general review of the Overwatch League, its format, how they handle playoffs, and kind of a temperature check of how everything went. First things first though, despite wanting to see NYXL play in NYC, I think we got the two best teams out of the playoffs on this patch. What we've learned about the double sniper meta is that, unfortunately for the NYXL, Zenyatta has a much lower role and only really gets played in sections where there's dive tanks involved, because obviously he synergizes and counters them quite well. However, on points where you set up for a mass firepower ranged snipe fest, I call it the Fortress comp, similar to firepower comps we've seen on Junkertown, but now I think Fortress is like the best word for it, because it's 3 tanks huddled around a bunker and snipers from range winning the battle on the margins of the map. The way that pans out is there's a tank battle up front where the halt hook combinations are pretty key to winning the frontline battle, but just as well, if your snipers are better, you simply will win more fights than not, because not only do they lay in damage into the front line from range, it's very difficult to set up any dive tactics to get back on any of these ranged sniper characters because Hanzo and Widowmaker have escapes, not to mention they're playing with all these tanks in front of you, which in essence makes for the comp to be a fortress that it's pretty hard to penetrate. There's some strategies that you can use in order to try to counter this, but generally speaking, the established meta is to fully enable your ranged sniper carries, and that's exactly what they did. EQO and Carpe absolutely popped off in their matches, and despite looking down at the start, London rebounded immediately after the great bamboozle that the Gladiators pulled off on them and essentially steamrolled their way right into the Grand Final. Now granted, Fusion had a bit of a closer series against the NYXL, which if you look just at map count, it might indicate that London is stronger, but I don't think it makes a lot of sense to try to judge the team's power level based on who they played, but instead what they're capable of individually, if that makes sense, because neither NYXL or the Valiant particularly work well for this meta that we've just established, because what have they done in the past? Well, NYXL has been surrounding Jonex Zenyatta play the entire season, and although Widow has always been an incredibly powerful hero, I think I can safely say the majority of Overwatch League Season 1 has been either the Zen carry meta, for NYXL at least, even if other teams can't really replicate that, or the Tracer carry meta, where Saebyeolbe just makes incredible plays. Even if he isn't statistically the best, he's a playmaker at that position. But neither of those heroes are really key this meta, and when you look over to the Valiant side of things, the question mark always was on the mechanical heights that their DPS could reach. They always saw their success with solid teamwork and looked the best whenever Soon and Agilities reached their peaks, but the problem is on the current patch, there isn't a whole lot of ways in order for your team to enable you to do a lot more, especially when you're playing this Fortress versus Fortress matchup. Realistically, it's just hit your individual plays. That's it. It's not like you can really get the Winston to get you favorable angles and you can use teamwork. Nope, for the most part, it's just you individually playing your role, and whichever team hits more shots in their role kind of wins the team fight. And that's how we ended up seeing both Valiant and NYXL, who got the week 1 bye, fall quite unceremoniously, I have to say. And to give them their due, we'll quickly mention both Boston and the Gladiators before we move on to the Grand Final. Boston ultimately wasn't well suited for this patch either, but I think their team and coaching staff can have their head hung high knowing that despite not really having the personnel in order to deal with the meta requirements, they rose to the occasion, took a series off the Fusion. Mistakes definitely was critical in the series that they won, whipping out a Hanzo that, let's face it, he wasn't signed on to play. So despite falling early in the playoffs, I think Boston are looking good for Season 2, assuming they get some roster pickups. As for the Gladiators though, haven't really had time to discuss or even really digest the outrageous nature of the drama of Fissure not being able to play. Granted, Remix didn't play poorly necessarily, and perhaps it could be said said that Remix would make less mistakes than Fissure could have, but he also, I think, didn't land as many plays as Fissure could have. With Fissure comes that risk where he might just take over the game, even if sometimes he gets caught out. It was instrumental to the Gladiator's success thus far, and you really have to wonder what possibly could go wrong internally with the team in order to bench a star player like that. I don't know if we'll ever get the full information on that one, but in any case, it isn't a tank carry meta anyway. If anything, the number one tank that you carry on right now is Orisa, oddly enough, and for my money, nobody has been better than Gesture. It's kind of funny to say it that way. I just realized I did it accidentally, but nobody's better than Gesture on the Orisa. He's actually been like the best Orisa for a long time, but she just hasn't been that critical of a role up until now. In this Fortress meta, sneaking halts in gets as much value as your sniper character's getting a headshot, because you can land the hook in order to pull the target towards you. The enemy's not going to be able to get over to your fortress to res them. Massive man advantage. It's as valuable as getting 6 shots from your snipers. And oh yeah, by the way, Birdring is back, baby. Not only is he playing dominantly on the Widow, he also can play the Hanzo whenever they need Prophet to play something else, the Brigitte, etc. London looks like the shape they were in stage 1. Terrifying. But I'll go one step further. I think they look even better than they ever have before. They're pulling out strats that they never really were comfortable with for the entirety of the Overwatch League. It looks like they finally understand how swaps work and how to make compositional changes quickly in the game, or how to run off-meta comps to throw your opponent off guard. So they're pulling a lot of rabbits out of the hat in that regard, and I hope to see more of that in the grand finals. But beyond that, individually, each player is popping off to a outrageous degree. Bedozen, who was deemed the second best Zenyatta in the world, Zen still playable and definitely important a lot of times, but not only that, you need that player to be able to swap off either to the Tracer or the Roadhog. And granted, I did just say Gesture is an amazing Orisa, so that might inflate the eye test for how good their Roadhog players have looked, but either Fury or Bedozen on it have manhandled the opposition and put them through a meat grinder up against the Big Pig. Now, to focus more on the matchup between the Fusion and the London Spitfire, this is where I start to get a little bit worried for the Philadelphia Fusion, because I think the flexibility and the depth of the London roster has been proven and kind of tested a bit more, because yeah, Prophet and Birdring were popping off too, but there also was a lot of evidence to show that the other elements of the team were pulling their weight, which is why some of these victories were so lopsided, because you're getting big impact from all the roles on the team, and when that happens, what the heck do you do? Whereas on the Fusion side, Boombox in comparison has looked fine. Poco and Hotba have definitely made impact plays, particularly with some Diva bombs that clutched out some key fights, and Sato has played incredibly consistent, but I don't know if he has shown the level of proficiency on the Orisa, and one step further, I don't know if the entirety of Fusion has had to show what they can do, because Carpe and EQO have been playing so well. I wouldn't say the rest of them have played badly, it's just so many fights Carpe just pops off and kills 3 things, so it's like, how do I judge the level of where everyone else is at? You're not even allowed to prove how good you are if the enemy's already dead because 3 headshots were hit by one of your snipers, you know what I mean? With that being said though, I think the discipline of the Fusion right now mirrors the level that it was at in stage 2, where they were 1 win away against winning entire stage. Don't forget that. This is a team that when they're on fire, they just win an entire LAN. If we didn't have the Overwatch League and we had the old tournament circuit, this is the type of team that might bomb out of a few LANs, but just out of the blue, steamroll one where everything's clicking and they easily take first place. So overall, as I said, I think London has proven that they have more depth in the roster, but what is the key to victory for Philadelphia if they were to take this win? Well, I think it isn't unreasonable to say that Carpe could be the best player in the server. I love Birdring. I'm so glad to see him back. He looks even better than he did in stage 1, but when everybody's in the Barclays Center and there's fans screaming at the stage, who's the guy that shows up big? Is it Birdring, or is it my MVP candidate for the Overwatch League, Carpe? Which I'm a little bit salty about because he didn't even get second place. Fissure took it, somewhat deservedly, I guess, but Fissure didn't even play in the playoffs. Come on. Carpe's out here grinding, doing things that are unreal. Birdring has had pockets of time where he's looked elite. Carpe has been elite the entire season. A few bad games, but generally speaking, Mr. Consistent. And he doesn't do it like Pine does by going off on wacky flanks. He doesn't make himself a liability. He is the anchor of this team, where if he's alive, any team fight is winnable. He is that kind of Widow, where it doesn't matter if you're down 2 people. If Carpe has an angle, they have a chance to win a fight. That level of carry, I think, can make up for the fact that perhaps overall across the board, the London Spitfire might have a little bit of an edge, because whether we like it or not, the meta we're in is DPS carry. It used to be that the Tracer carried the majority of the Overwatch League games, whether they were getting kills or not, just sort of this space that they controlled, created opportunities for your teammates. This is the main reason why I think Boston in Stage 3 went undefeated, despite mistakes not being the best Widowmaker, because Striker was allowed to make all the space in the world on Tracer. Going to Stage 4, all of a sudden they have to swap their Widowmaker player because that entire premise didn't exist anymore. But now, in this meta, you just can't contest Widow with anything realistically. So the percentage of the carry on that one role is even bigger than it ever was on Tracer, which is why I always picked Carpe for my MVP. That was my logic behind it, because he played both the Tracer and the Widow, which when you combine the amount of control those roles take on the game, that's how I justify picking him over Jonak, because I think now it's finally been proven that the Zenyatta position is less meta immune than Carpe's playstyle, and you can bring a lot more to the team being in Carpe's position. A little bit unfair for him, obviously. It's easier to be an MVP candidate when your role is more important, but alas, that's how sports work, isn't it? But let's look at the flex DPS of both teams as well. It's really hard to deny the power that EQO has, but silently behind the scenes, Prophet has been an MVP candidate as well. I think part of the problem for him is that he actually spreads himself a bit too thin. He's elite on all the heroes he plays, but it's easier to draw a blind eye to how good Prophet is when he's the best Brigida, for example. It's not really a role that pops off the screen, but I would put him equal to the power of Carpe on the Tracer role, which I doubt Carpe is going to play anyway, but definitely ahead of EQO on the Brigida and the Hanzo. But I do give the edge to EQO's Pharah. Prophet has really stepped up and played a lot more Pharah this meta, which I think is really important for them, because the aerial advantage that the Pharah brings, the threat and angles, is incredibly important, and if you just can't run it, your opponent can abuse that fact. So Prophet learning Pharah was a really big deal, and he's played sick, but I think EQO is one of the best Pharahs in the league. And although Prophet has silenced critics multiple times in this way, where you might say, well, Jake's the best Junkrat in the league, right? But then they play him in a stage playoff, and Prophet just pulls out Junkrat out of nowhere, and he looks just as good, if not better. Prophet is just that guy. He's Mr. Steal your hero. Oh, you thought you were the best at that? Nope, mine too. Problem is, when you're talking about these top level players, is that even if Prophet's number 1, there's like diminishing returns a few ranks down. There's only so good a player can get, especially at the flex DPS role. Whereas Widowmaker, you theoretically can hit every single shot on your screen, and sometimes we see Carpe or Pine do plays like that. The flex role is kind of capped out at what it can do, because it often requires more game sense than mechanical depth. You can shoot your rockets perfectly, but if the enemy just dodged them, there's not a whole lot you can do, right? There's always a percentage luck chance when you're playing some of these other roles, which is why I like playing the flex DPS role, by the way. Not belittling its importance at all, but I think what the question will come down to is who makes more space for their carry? Is Carpe going to be more comfortable, or is Birdring going to be more comfortable, and who steps up bigger in that matchup? I really could see this going either way, and I have this huge urge to pick London. These players have a ton of history competing in Apex. Prophet, of course, played for GC Busan, which Royal roaded their way past even Lunatic High, winning Season 4. Kongdu Panthera, although never won a title, was incredibly close and was definitely one of the top Korean teams for a long time, and I really want to believe that London has their act together, because they've disappointed us for, I would say, the majority of the season, actually. They came out to a rip-roaring start when a lot of the teams were still figuring out what Overwatch League was all about, but as the dust settled, they fizzled. Until just now, where they ate their Popeye spinach and now are superhuman strength, but we've been hurt before, London. I don't know if I can handle my heart being broken again. I would say, in this matchup, London should be favored, but I'm going to be picking what I think is the underdog in the Philadelphia Fusion to just pull out big plays and key moments that robs London of their glory. I think kind of similar to the NYXL series, a few of these maps might convincingly go over to London, but over the course of 3 series, I don't think that Birdring is going to keep up with Carpe. I think Philadelphia win, and Carpe wins the Grand Final MVP. The downside is whenever Carpe loses a couple Widow duels, he usually tilts and starts to die more in the few games that he's lost, so maybe that happens too. Who knows? The playoffs have certainly not gone as any anybody has expected, so we're all just flipping coins at this point, let's just be honest. But now I want to move on to talk about the format of the playoffs. Of course, there's a little bit of a controversy over the patch, over the long break in between Stage 4 and the playoffs. Is it an advantage or disadvantage to go into the second round immediately, having a bye week, not being able to play a high-level game to get experience? And I want everybody to be clear, I don't want to sound like I'm making excuses for anybody, because the format was set at the start of the league. Everyone just has to play on the same rule set, so it's just fair. Even if it disadvantages you for some reason, it's still fair, because that's how life works. We can't get extremely excited when a Western team, Envious, wins Apex Season 1 after a fortuitous meta swap as they find the best diva player at the time, Mickey, and ride that meta in order to win. In the same way, we can't be upset when Zenyatta kind of is weak in a given meta, and all of a sudden the entire premise of how NYXL won most of their games kind of falls short. I mean, it just happens. This is esports. However, with that being said, though, I think we can think critically about how to best optimize the league as a whole and the playoffs. And to make this point, I want you to think for a second, what would have happened if for some reason, just go with this for a second, doesn't make sense at first, but I'll get there. Philadelphia Fusion had the bye week, not NYXL. If NYXL got to play up against Boston, who I think is either the or the second weakest team that was in the playoffs, it's between them and Gladiators, would NYXL be better up against that fight with the Fusion or worse? Granted, the theory of it is, if you don't show up to play in that week 1 match, you obviously can get kicked out early, so playing more just gives you more risk to lose. However, I'm of the belief that NYXL going into the first Fusion set did not iron out their strategy for this meta at all. It just showed all over the screen. They were clearly under-practiced for the patch. Now, it's their fault and their responsibility to be up to speed, but how do you get quality practice when all the rest of the teams are gone for the season? A lot of the playoff teams you're going to have a chance to face, so how do you scrim them? What meaningful practice can NYXL really get in order to be prepared for this? Wouldn't playing up against a weaker team on stage be the best practice in order to iron this out? Because let's say even in a world where they come out incredibly flat and Boston wins that first series, NYXL made leaps and bounds improvement by the time they went into the second series against the Fusion. They figured a ton of stuff out in a very short amount of time. I think that learning process has to happen in real matches. And if they were able to cut their teeth on a bit of an easier game first, we would have had a better semifinal. Now, pay attention, because this can very easily be like, oh, you're just making excuses for NYXL. You think they would win if they just had... No. They probably still lose, actually, because the Fusion are sick on this patch. So they probably still end up losing. Overall, I don't know if that changes the result. I just think we get better Overwatch if we just eliminate this bye week thing altogether. The meta is kind of tailor fit for a DPS-focused team, and that's what Fusion are. So in any case, I think they just have an advantage. That's how they play the game. But what I don't like to see is what we know is a very hard-working, top-level team look completely befuddled by a patch and unprepared. Sure, of course, when you get the bye week, you're able to review the games of the team you're going to be facing, but this is probably also the worst meta for that to be an advantage, because Philly don't really show you any clever looks. They do simple strats and click heads. They're not a very elaborate team. To some degree, having two snipers at a safe distance, jockeying for angles, they just eventually hit shots. There's no, like, strategical counter that just stops that from working, but that's probably more of an issue with just the way the patch works. But in any case, I think I'd much rather see changes to the way the playoffs work due to this. I don't think a bye week is a good idea unless there is a double elimination bracket, which I think is a lot more fun. It makes more sense for esports, especially with Overwatch, because if you look at other esports, a single map takes forever. Whereas in Overwatch, you can sort of speed run your way by exploiting a few strategies the opponent isn't up to speed with yet in the course of like an hour, which in other esports games, a single map might take an hour. And I can back up this argument by saying that if you look at Boston, how much they improved after having a bit of a break in between their sets. NYXL definitely did. London especially completely revitalized after a change in perspective and having a bit more of a simple focus game plan, which works for the meta. There's a lot of really good aspects of how the playoffs are set up. The breaks in between the series I think are really good. I just think there needs to be a bit more of a contingency plan, considering we're probably always getting a new patch every stage and every playoffs, just by the way Overwatch is changed. There's new heroes coming out all the time. Balance just keeps changing. So this problem of patches completely ruining a team or having to reinvent themselves in a way is just always going to be an issue we all have to be accepting of. And because of that, I think the proportion of how the playoffs work compared to the season just doesn't really make much sense. Because think about it, there was a ton of Overwatch games. 40 games in the regular season. And think NYXL get a bye to have to play up against one of the strongest teams in their first match. And yeah, it's on them, of course, to make the comeback and adjust over the day break. And they nearly pushed it to a third series, but their entire season is like condensed into such a small, isolated 8 maps, which in proportion to how many games you play in the regular season, how many stage playoffs there were that don't amount to anything at all other than a bit of a performance bonus, it just seems out of proportion for me. I would much rather there be less regular season games and more playoffs, because these games were insane. The quality of competition, the improvement over the breaks, that's incredible. You really can see the players evolve and the teams figure things out. It feels like a LAN again, because that's one downside of the league format is that you have your set schedule, you play through everybody, you're not really forced to climb up the rankings to beat better and better teams, whereas that's what a bracket does. The weaker teams drop off and the matchups get harder and harder as you go up. I want to see more of this in the Overwatch League, not less, because right now we have the stage playoffs no one takes seriously, and the normal playoffs, which, although there was a lot of series, in proportion I think is much smaller in just time than it deserves to be with how important it is to the entire season. So we might do away with the bye week anyway, because we're going to be getting expansion teams next season, but I would much prefer that the playoffs go into a double elimination bracket. It would give us more games and really 6 storylines up that ride on the lower bracket. Because just imagine, what if the Gladiators decide after losing, nope, we're putting Fissure back in. Do they make a climb through the lower bracket? How far do they get? The tension in those games would be sick. Does NYXL figure out the meta and start to innovate more strategies? They're the team that started pulling out Ana, who I think is really strong in a lot of situations on this patch. Against the multi-tank, against the Brigitte, we get to see them develop and very likely beat a lot of these lower ranked teams that drop down to the lower bracket. So whether they end up in the grand finals or not, I think we just get more quality Overwatch if that's the case. Better storylines, more high quality games, because let's face it, were the games in stage 4 consequential at all? A few teams were jockeying for playoffs, but NYXL didn't take practices seriously. People don't really understand what the term sandbagging means. It means they're not grinding the hardest to win because they have no incentive, which definitely was true. Does that bite them in the end where they're maybe not as strong going into the playoffs? I mean, maybe. I think really what they should have done in stage 4 is start training Jonek on other heroes, for example. But how could they have known that Zenyatta wouldn't have been a key centerpiece to the meta in the next patch? Like, you just don't know these things. Other improvements that we could make to the overall league, I think. A lot of people have said these things. I just want to sneak them into the end here since to get them documented that I care about these things. Map picks should definitely be a thing. I think it only makes sense. I think it increases the level of games that you can have, makes it a lot harder to absolutely steamroll an opponent, and it makes it much more interesting when you see comebacks happen. If you start to mount a comeback, the enemy who has the advantage gets to pick the map, and that makes your comeback, if you do have one, an even bigger feat. Also, this was mentioned in the Oversight podcast with Monte Cristo and Thorin way back when, but there needs to be a point system to allocate weight, I think both to games that are later in the season, but also I think there should be some seeding advantage to the stage playoffs. They improved it over time with including more teams in, which I think is a good idea, but there should be some end of season advantage to getting to the stage playoffs and performing well in them. I don't know what these point values should amount to, but wins in stage 1 should not be weighted as highly as wins in stage 4. That being said though, the 6 teams that did make it into this season's playoffs, I think we're definitely deserving. The only one that looks to be a bit of an issue is Boston, who did not have a good stage 4 at all, but even in this weighted system would get a lot of a boost from that stage 3 10-0 run anyway. So it's not like any system is foolproof. And in any case, of the 6 teams that didn't make it in, Outlaws, Dynasty, Shock, Fuel, Mayhem, and Dragons, would any of them really make a significant run in the playoffs anyway? I don't think anyone got snubbed from the playoffs due to the format. Oddly enough, I think the strongest of those 6 teams is the Dallas Fuel, which I think is a credible argument because they beat the Valiant in stage 4. They give NYXL a run for their money in the stage playoffs. I think they'd have a good chance of beating the likes of Boston for sure, and probably even the Gladiators without Fissure. But the problem is, There's no way that we could ever devise a system that allowed the Dallas Fuel to lose as much as they did for 3 stages and just win slightly more in stage 4 and look really hot. That just isn't really a thing, right? Which is interesting with a league system, because when you have old school LANs, realistically, as long as you're a competitor, you get invited to most of the LANs. So you got a shot to make a tournament run at any point, which is an interesting difference to the way the league works. Because if the playoffs was a normal LAN, there's no way the Dallas Fuel wouldn't get invited, just based on their popularity alone, even. But that about wraps it up for all my thoughts about the season. It's been an incredible run. They've got to be changing a lot of things for season 2, because there's going to be expansion teams, and unless there's just going to be Overwatch playing 24/7, I don't know how they're figuring out the way that the structure of the league is going to work, but I'm sure they are hard at work dreaming that stuff up right now as they start to sign on franchises and stuff. The Too Long Didn't Watch version of this, I'd say, is that I want more emphasis on the playoffs, the stage and the finals playoffs. Double elimination for both would be nice. I think in proportion, there just was way too many regular season games, which sort of gives way more stage time to matchups that aren't as good. Now, that might be an opinion a lot of people disagree with, because there was a ton of hype around Florida versus the Shanghai Dragons, for example, in stage 4. But I think that's just because they're at the exact bottom, whereas some of the other on the fringe of playoff teams didn't generate much hype. And overall, the more serious matches definitely got more viewership and more hype overall. So what I want to see is the playoffs get expanded to hold more weight and to last longer, even if that means you have to remove some games from the regular season. Perfectly fine with that. Oh, and longer breaks between stages, and why the heck was the break between stage 4 and the playoffs so long? I don't know. Guys, let me know what you think about all these things in the comment section down below. If you will be attending the grand final at the Barclays Center, I've got the opportunity to go. Blizzard did cover my travel expenses to be able to attend the event, so I thank them very much for that. If you see me at the arena, be sure to say hi and follow us on Twitter so you know whenever we're doing any meetups or get updates about what we're doing. If you enjoyed the video, please be sure to leave it a like. It really does help us out. Lets us know that you're enjoying the content. And if you haven't already, please subscribe, because we upload each and every day. So you're going to want to hit the bell icon so that you get notified when our videos go live. That's been it for me. I've been FREEDO for Your Overwatch. I'll see you guys next time.